sweet pies. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, sugar and eggs and dairy and wheat come together to make sweet pies. I'll look at the difference between a tart and a pie and whether it even matters, and consider whether a cheesecake was a pie, especially in the 18th century context when cheese and cake both had more elastic meanings than they do now. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is while anything with a crust is a sort of pie, and so tarts are definitely a particular subset of pie, after rifling around in the past of pie, I am pretty convinced that without rich, bored people, there would be no tarts, and that we have tea parlors and coffee houses and drinking chocolate shops to thank for the spread of the tart into the hands of regular people. And in America, we have the dearth of bakeries to thank for the general absence of cute little tarts in our modern life. In the 18th century, just about anything could be made into a sweet pie, and where they went in meal arrangements in the 18th century depended on what part of the 18th century it was, which version of the meal service you adhered to, and where on the economic ladder you sat. There were lots of variables at play, and I am going to do my best to sort them out. And hopefully, I can point you in the direction of some interesting and tempting sweet tarts and pies before we are all done here. Last week, we established that in the 18th century, a pie was anything with a paste crust, top or bottom or as the whole cooking vessel, and that pies, while more or less everybody food back in England, became rich people food and special occasion food in the colonies. Because wheat flour became available to more people in the 18th century colonies, right at the same time as butter, lard, and sugar, sweet pies would become what people thought of as pie generally as the colonies became America. And the early wheat flour shortage, along with the skill and practice pie required, would eventually push the savory, everyday pie off the table. Then where did this subset of crusted things, the tarts, the dainties, the sweeties, and all that jazz emerge from big pie? It can be weird how war and food trip all over each other, even when I'm not expecting it. War and tea and coffee and chocolate and tarts and more war and kings seem to start to get all tangled together in the 17th century. And who do I mainly blame? Well, in the 18th century, largely I lay the final tangle at the feet of the only major European king to outmatch Queen Elizabeth I or II for length of reign. Okay, there's like this one Franz Joseph and some guys who ran duchies and stuff that are the answers to bar trivia, but I am talking about Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Now, he came from a long line of Louis and watched La France squander blood and treasure on fighting against each other and carving and then re-carving up the country. Why, he asked, why couldn't all that blood and treasure be refocused on building him some better, fancier palaces, developing fancier silks and paintings and chair styles? And if people really needed to fight, for heaven's sakes, they should do it with words over the card table. I mean, sure, if someone really had a hankering to learn how a cannon works or brandish a sword, they should really go fight the English at least, or maybe plunder a Spanish ship, or establish a colony or something. But stop with all the fighting at home. It messes up the wine deliveries, interferes with the royal progress from summer palace to winter palace to hunting lodge, and so on. So Louis XIV worked very hard to recast the nobility as courtiers and not as knights. If they still needed to fight one another in France, they would now fight over who got to be groom of the bedchamber in May, like when the flower arrangements were best. And they had better do it by sniping about wardrobe faux pas, so they quit killing the peasants that raised the king's favorite poulets and tend to his favorite blooming rind cheese caves. It is important to note that moving all the fighting outside the borders didn't save any money. It just meant the kingdom's money went to other pursuits, many of which we can wander around in or look at in museums. And it certainly didn't halt the bloodshed. It just moved much of the death outside the borders and killed the farmers of other places. But It left more of the French peasantry intact, and that was Louis's real concern here. Spain, another home of the tart, saw their rise as the treasure galleons continued to pour their wealth into the kingdom. Like Louis in France, the Bourbon-descended kings of Spain were also working to end the in-country bloodshed, especially after that disastrous Spanish Succession War that saw the loss of the Netherlands. The expanded kingdoms in South and Central America were looking for more autonomy as well. All this friction abroad meant that there was less panic inside the kingdom and a need for less of a war footing for the nobility. So life in the court slowed down and there was more time to sip chocolate and nibble tarts. It seemed that the thrilling action-packed days of squabbling as four-ish kingdoms and conducting the Reconquista to end El Andalus, as well as the extra innings played against Portugal, were gone. But don't worry, Spain. Napoleon will be along to liven things up. So, as Spanish and French, as well as Italian and Austro-Hungarian court life became less about the battlefield and turned inward, the arts of dining and of snacking, for the wealthy, began to grow. Grand, even ridiculous banqueting had already been on hand, but now, as war and plague deaths were reduced, there were more bored nobles wandering about, looking for ways to fill their days. And one of those things was throwing elaborate parties and gatherings with ever more elaborate and dainty things to eat that each required their own little bit of ceremony. So big picture, by turning the nobility from a class of fighters for and against the sovereign into courtiers, turned them into dandies in pursuit of the consumption of luxuries. An oversimplification? A bit. But the broad strokes are there for sure. Battles were still fought, and they were more often over proximity to the king's chair and purse, rather than on the ground over this field and castle or that. And the European peasantry was largely relieved, but the inhabitants of West Africa, South America, North America, South and East Asia were to regret it for lifetimes to come. And thus, with this shift in focus, tarts rose to prominence. These dainty, just a few bite items were delicate pastry shells filled with tasty, sweet, complex, and invariably sweetened fillings. So, the Queen of Hearts tarts from last week's nursery rhyme, we always assume them to be fruit or jam tarts, but they could have just as easily been an eggy custard tart or a cheese curd tart. Say, flavored with lemon and honey, or oranges and saffron, or almond cream and rose water. But definitely not a mincemeat tart. The rhyme says specifically a summer's day, and mincemeat was a winter food. And with meat, so not really dainty at all. The other important part of both of the nursery rhymes from last week, those pies and tarts were for the king and queen, not for the maid hanging out the clothes, which translates for our story in the 17th and even the 18th centuries, except for the odd wedding or festival day or coronation or announcement of the birth of a prince. Most people were not eating sweet pies, and they were absolutely not eating tarts. Rich people were, but not most people. Tarts and sweet pies were mainly on the tables and settles at hunt dinners of the rich, at banquets, and in the solars of castles and manors. That is where the tarts showed up. They were served with coffee and tea and drinking chocolate. They were part of the rituals that filled up great swaths of leisure time imposed on the nobility and the gentry by the kings of all France and Spain, and even the kings and queens of Britain. As borders became more secure, there was now time to sit about and nibble on dainties and snipe about the behavior of this one or that one at the court. And all those countries I mentioned at the top, Spain, Portugal, France, and so on, they each retained a tradition of tart and even expanded upon it and spread it around the world with their colonization efforts. So now we have Chinese egg tarts, which are the descendants of the pastel de nata of Portuguese sailors described to the women of Macau they had cooking for them. Many early versions substituted coconut milk for the dairy milk in the custard. Well, because no cows on Macau at the time. All of the Chinese dairy was up north. Sweetened condensed milk would push out coconut milk in the 20th century. But here, in the modern era, it's actually fun to watch coconut milk return to the tarts. French influence, okay, this is the 19th century, so later, but same effect, drove the creation of the Vietnamese bánh noi, butter tart in Vietnam. And French bakery windows in the fancy parts of any cosmopolitan city show off their patisserie tarts and make nearly everyone feel underdressed for the occasion of simply viewing them. Anyway, in the 18th century, if you were a rich noble in Europe, your cook made you dainty tarts to nibble over your tea or coffee or chocolate. If you were a rising merchant in a bustling European town or city, or were similarly well off, by the end of the century, you could get tarts from the local bakery for special treats. And if you ran a Spanish encomienda in South or Central America, you set up a bakery on your plantation to get your hands on the sweet treats of home to savor with your daily chocolate. The you in this case could be a viceroy or an abbess or a governor or simply the owner of a vast hacienda and ranchero. But if you were in the North American colonies, well, you were on the wild frontier. There were almost no rich people. There were basically no gracious establishments where one might hold court in a palace or a bustling gracious cafe. Pining for opera? Wishing for elaborately painted ceilings to meditate under in prayer? Hankering a nice sit-down in a well-furnished library for a good read? In the 18th century, North America was largely going to disappoint. Head to New Orleans or Mexico City, Salvador or Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, or catch a vacation with a family friend running a coffee or sugar plantation on Saint-Domingue. The city of Cap Français had a nice theater, the Comédie du Cap, by then. Except for a vanishingly small number of gracious plantations in Maryland and Virginia and South Carolina, practicing the version of brutal feudalism that had morphed into outright race-based chattel slavery, there really was almost no gracious living taking place in the British North American colonies. In the 17th century, the future founding families of the nation were largely living in single-story 2- or 3-room houses. And by the 18th century, ovens were just moving back inside. There were no dining rooms. There were no solars or tea salons. And most important of all, there was almost no free time that needed frittering away. There was a land to conquer and colonies to set up. And thus, even those people that did have indoor ovens and wheat flour and sugar and so on to make tarts, they had baking tins and only time for 2.5 or 3 meals a day. So the tarts were large and were served at the meal table, not as a snack. So the tiny tart of America never really had a chance to get off the ground. All that viewing of the Great British Bake Off that I did during the lockdown period of the pandemic turned out to be research. Wasn't that clever of me? And something that surprised me was the Brits wrinkling their faces as they spoke of the overly sweet American pie. Well, when I pull up the British cookbooks, the 18th century references I have, and compare it to what is in the 19th century very American cookbooks, they may have a point. The British continued their tradition of the savory pie and fruit and spice spiked savory pie, and they were very fond of their gooseberry pie. Americans, with our rum and molasses and increasingly cheap Caribbean sugar, we may have gone a bit wild with the sweet. Colonials were paying for sugar in salt cod and salt beef and had a shorter shipping route. The English at home had to pay for sugar in money, and the smuggling of bulky sugar, anyway, wasn't as efficient. Colonial access to sugar was definitely greater all up and down the economic ladder than it was back on the home island. The other thing that jumps out as unexpected, while Amelia Simmons gave 9 different paste or crust recipes, she always gave recipes for large single pies, whether sweet or savory. So now that we are in sweet pie land, what, you ask, were the 18th century sweet tarts? The familiar ones for sure: apple and peach and strawberry and plum and mulberry and gooseberry, cranberry up north if you had enough sugar or maple or West Indian molasses, possibly blueberry. Back then they were tiny, typically the size of a pencil eraser, if you can remember what those look like, but packed with tart, fruity flavor. Currant and potato pie recipes were also available, and it seems towards the end of the century, white or Irish potatoes and sweet potatoes both were used. Geography definitely determined the variety. And there is one sweet pie that was around, but we have lost, and that was grape pie. English cookbooks never had grape pie, as grapes mostly stopped growing in England before cookbooks became widespread. And in the 18th century, cooks in the colonies thought of themselves as English, or German or Swedish or Dutch, and were cooking in the style of their home country. Or they were instructing their servant or enslaved cooks to make food in the style of England, etc., etc. So that was mostly what was happening in colonial kitchens: European food with local substitutions. All through the 19th century and into the 20th, there are American recipes for gooseberry pie. And yes, there are American gooseberries. They are a different species, but same genus, so close enough for the colonial cooks. But the grape pie, it shows up a few places in later cookbooks to show that it was there. But there is no way grape pies were not being made alongside gooseberry and currant and prune pies in the 18th century, especially in places where North American grapes grew in abundance, like the Catawba and Concords. That's the source of that purple grape flavor, or the Niagara, or the Scuppernongs, and the Muscadine. The drawbacks of these wild grapes when it came to cookbookery was that the skins were often tough, so they had to be scalded and removed. And the seeds were bitter when bitten, so were typically spit out, so like, ew, rude, or had to be removed by the cook in one of a few laborious ways. So when including pie fruits, most people stuck to writing about things with one large pit, like peaches, or things that were easy to core, like apples, or just had seeds that could be eaten, like cranberries, currants, and gooseberries. But now that we have access to ever more varieties of thin-skinned and seedless varieties, I say it's time to bring back the grape pie, or maybe grape tarts. And speaking of tarts, back in the 18th century North American colonies, there really were no recipes for small individual tarts, or none that were widely circulated. Individual cooks and individual houses might have had a specialty, but they were not being made at the common hearth. The delicate pastries of 1 or 2 or 4 bites with a filling of jam or sweet cheese or egg custard or cream were almost invisible in North American British colonial cuisine. The items in cookbooks labeled tarts and pies were both large dish items. In fact, unlike many of the pies and tarts of Europe, they were all of them, to be baked in a dish or a tin. Which is part of why today, those little tarts we can hold in our hand mesmerize many an American as we pass by the pastry window of French, Portuguese, Brazilian, Austrian, Italian, and Vietnamese bakeries. Tiny, tempting tarts cause confusion and consternation as they pass by on Cantonese dim sum carts and peek at us from the windows of the local Mexican panaderias. Where, we ask, where are the adorable American tarts? Based on Amelia Simmons and then the cookbooks that followed her, American tarts were always large, and like many another colonial baked thing, the definitions were compressed. The only tarts in the Everybody lexicon were fruit tarts. With or without that top crust was variable. Now, due to the politics of the special occasion pie that was starting to emerge, colonial North American fruit tarts seemed to generally have top crusts. And the big pies needed a top crust because they were large and because they were a bit for showing off. I mean, everyone could get fruit, but not everyone could get the wheat flour and fat to make a crust. Oh, and then also not burning the top crust and making it look pretty, that was also a feat and another way to show off. And because things without a top crust seemed to fall under the category of pudding. Those first pompion or pumpkin pies, they are actually listed as puddings. Okay. So when everything boils down, in the 18th century, pie was anything with a crust, even if it was a pudding or a tart. And before metal baking sheets and plates became widespread in the 18th century, generally the crust was the cooking and transport vessel as well. We went over all of this last week. For things that needed to be sturdy and sit in a pantry or be able to rattle around in a pack for a bit. Those were just going to be meal type things, so savory pies and pasties and banquet presentations and such. Such items, particularly banquet things, might have sweet spices, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and contain fruit, say a venison and sour cherry pie, or ducks with plums, or capons with citron peels and spices. So these were all going to be thought of in terms of meals and not snacks. And since we are speaking of meals and sitting at table, we need to take a moment and a detour and consider just how dining worked in the 18th century colonies. No matter who you were in the colonies, at the start of the century, all the food that you were going to eat for that meal was on the table when you started, even if you had servants. If you were a simple household, there would usually be a single main dish and some sort of bread or ash cake, if you're doing okay. Any fruit or nuts or cheese might come after. If you were doing better and had sugar on hand and an indoor oven, or maybe even a tableside brazier for some extra flair, roasted birds or fish, along with slices of meat, would be accompanied with sauces as the centerpiece. Cooked vegetables and fruits and any puddings or pies would all be present. And the arrangement of all of these dishes was important. Symmetry and balance of dishes and the food was thoughtfully considered and judged by your relatives and guests. Round dishes had to coordinate or match. A large dish in the center with the main item should be set about appropriately with smaller dishes of accompaniments. Sours across from sours and sweets across from sweet. Knowing the right sauces for the right dishes was an important part of the hosting craft. And instead of passing the prepared dishes around the table, the diners would actually pass their plates to whoever was sitting near an item, and they would serve the food to you. Dining, even in quite formal settings at this time, was a communal and rather cooperative activity. If you were super fancy, and this became more of a feature in the second half of the century, there might even be enough dishes for there to be one or even two removes. That is, the dishes of the first course would be removed and then replaced by a second course, which is where, at last, I get to the question of a liver pudding being appropriate for the second course. The first remove or course would be the savory items, meat and vegetable dishes of all sorts, including the still present but increasingly rare meat pies. But the second course is where the sweets resided, the tarts and the puddings and the custards, in crusts or not. So a liver pudding, is this a meat pie for the first course or a sweet pudding for the second? In the 18th century, generally, the most notable things about liver would be its fattiness and its irony flavor. The fattiness definitely would push livers towards the sweets table, but the blood-heavy nature of the fresh liver, which gave it the flavor of iron, would inspire any cook who is making this into a pudding to soak it for a long time, overnight or even days in changes of water and salt water to remove much of that bloody iron flavor. And with all that work put in, why not add spices? And if you were rich enough to have spices in the kitchen, you definitely also had sugar. So a liver pudding with eggs and sugar and spice and maybe even cream served in a crust was possibly fit for a second course table. I mean, if it was served alongside West India preserves of allspice, spiked ginger root, and mangoed melon, then it might even be a sweet enough treat to end the meal. And such a gently savory pudding, enjoyed for its quaking, melty, fat texture, would call to mind the modern habit of serving seared slices of foie gras, the fattened livers of geese and other waterfowl, with fig jams or sticky cherry conserve or spiced grape preserves. But let's face it, given a choice, a marrow pudding with cream, ground almonds, soaked breadcrumbs, and rose water would really be the favored choice for the sweets table. And that brings us all back around to the North American colonies and their big sweet tarts and pies. For the most part, just as with crust generally, not so many cooks were going to be fussing around with fancy things like liver pies on a daily basis. And when they did, they would be special treats, but overall not too fussy. Sweet liver puddings or marrow pies for the second course. In the end, that was just a thing for the bored nobility with a servant's wing full of cooks. But back here on the wild colonial frontier, the lines were drawn much more starkly. If it had meat, it was probably a practical meat pie for travel or a tasty fruit tart for sweetness and celebration. Now, the sweet cheese pie, it was around. But again, why fuss around with cheese curd pies? Though a curd pie could be made with sour milk so as not to waste. But all the same, the best cheese pies were the ones that needed expensive and troublesome to get flavorings. And come on, I mean, the fruit is right here. So heading into the end of the 18th century and the creation of America, the sweet pie became what everybody thought of as the pie. Fussy little tarts and fussy custard and cheese pies were largely left behind. Pies or tarts cooked in the iron skillets or the developing lidded fireplace pots that would become known as bake pots or bake ovens and finally Dutch ovens would be for many people the preferred way to bake pies. Now, future America will have to wait for future immigrants as independents or hired cooks to remind us of the cheese pie, which will reemerge as cheesecake and return the dainty tart back to the plates of the people. And next week, I'll continue to hang out with Grain and take a look at the 18th century beer scene. It is much less bleak than last century. Now there are barley and hops and better barrel makers and Germans. The colonial beer landscape begins to expand. And as with so many things related to food, as soon as there are choices to be had, the choosers begin to get judged. So join me for a discussion of what North American beers emerged and what social, economic, and political messages they started to send. Thanks for listening. Any questions or quibbles you have about the episode will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter, where I am most active. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me become more visible to more food and history-curious people. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and a link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio at THOA Food and in the show description.